Hey everybody, welcome to my lovely home office. This is where I come to you now for our virtual lessons. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're staying healthy, all that stuff. I miss seeing you in class every day, but this is just kind of our new reality for right now. So I wanted to follow up with you guys this week and just connect and make a little video here for you talking about some of the different aspects of MLA style, because that's been a big part of what you've been working on this week in terms of your upcoming research project. And so what we'll be doing over this next few minutes of the video is just kind of diving into the different aspects of MLA style, and I'll be going over the 7 sources that you looked at for the MLA Olympics activity. Before we dive into those 7 sources that you looked at for the MLA Olympics activity, I want to talk just kind of briefly and broadly about MLA style. MLA 8 came out in 2016, so a couple years ago, and with this newest edition, they've kind of changed the way they look at sources. So now we have this sort of core elements model, and we'll talk through just each of those briefly here. The first thing you'll see with an MLA citation is the author's name. Now that always goes last name, comma, first name, and if there's multiple authors, there's some different scenarios which you can read about more within the full style guide. But basically we have the author's name, followed by a period. We have the title of the source, followed by a period, and a lot of times titles will be in quotation marks. Sometimes they'll be italicized. Just depends on kind of what you're doing. Then next comes the title of the container, followed by a comma. Then if there are other contributors, so sometimes there are editors of books, sometimes there are translators with multimedia sources, sometimes there are directors, or sometimes you might list actors that star in a film if that's relevant. So that's really what we mean when we're talking about other contributors. Then version, if there's some sort of version number. So again, if we're talking about a textbook that has multiple editions, the 3rd edition would be an example of a version. Number. Number can mean a few things, but it typically refers to scholarly journal articles which have a volume number and then an issue number, and we'll see what that looks like in a minute. Publisher can be a few things, but it's typically whoever published that source. Sometimes it can be the same as some of the other information that you have, so you really just have to kind of assess what you have and pick and choose sometimes. Sometimes there's not a 100% correct way to create a citation, so just keep that in mind. The publication date comes next, followed by a comma, and then finally the location, and that is usually either page numbers or it could be minutes and seconds if we're talking about a video and you're just talking about a specific clip, or sometimes that could be the URL, the hyperlink, or the DOI number. DOI numbers are kind of these stable hyperlinks that will be there forever for scholarly journal articles. So the first source that you have within this activity was a newspaper article, specifically an article from The Breeze, which is JMU's student newspaper. So you can see when you open the full online article in your web browser, we've got The Breeze, we've got the logo here, we kind of get some indicators that this might be a newspaper. Then we scroll down and we see the title here, Technological Overload Desensitizes People to Reality. It's pretty obvious that's the title just from the size of it, the placement of it. We can see here that Tess Gibbons is the author, and it says that she's a contributing columnist. The article was written on September 7th, 2017, and then a little info there tells us about how long it'll take to read, and then the article itself follows. So we create our citation here from that information that we just discussed. We have Gibbons, comma, Tess, that comes first. She's the author, followed by a period. The next thing you'll see here is the title of the article, Technological Overload Desensitizes People to Reality. Now that is a smaller entity, so it goes in quotation marks, followed by a period. The next thing we see is The Breeze. That's the publisher, or the container, if you will, and that gets italicized just because publications get italicized. Then next we have the date, 7 September 2017. Remember that MLA chooses this day, month, year format, and that months that are longer than 4 letters get abbreviated. The next thing we see then is the location information, and in this case it's the hyperlink to the article. You'll notice that it starts with the www. We leave off the https or the http://. We just have the URL there. And then the last thing you see here, and this is an optional element, but I strongly prefer it just for keeping track of when you completed certain aspects of your research, is putting an access date. And typically anything that has a URL or that could potentially change or have multiple versions online, we tend to put the access date. And for this example, I chose to put today's date. You would put whatever date that you accessed this article. The next source that you had was a documentary, and I shared the link to you for that documentary via Netflix. So we can see here from the screen that the title is The Great Hack. It's via Netflix. It came out in 2019. Let's actually go to the IMDb link and look at a little bit more. So here we've got that IMDb hyperlink that I gave you through your instructions. And we can see, I just gave you the IMDb link because that gives you basically all of the information about any sort of film. And here you can see the title, The Great Hack, came out in 2019, came out actually the 24th of July. It's a documentary, you can see how long it is. But it also easily collects some information about, say, the directors in this case, the writers, the stars. This is a documentary, so we're not really talking about actors or stars in this case. Here we would probably care most about the directors and potentially the writers. Those are two of the most important things when we're talking about a documentary. So when we put that information together to form our citation, you see that with this source, the first thing we see is the title. Now, that's typical of any sort of video, especially a documentary like this. The people that contributed to the documentary are kind of secondary to the actual source itself. So we have The Great Hack. It appears in italics because it's the title of a film, and that's just what we do, followed by a period. The next thing you should have there is directed by, and then we list the two directors that were listed on that IMDb website, followed by a comma. I've also included here who it was written by, and again, this is one of those times where the information that you include might vary depending on the type of research that you're doing with the source and what is really the most pertinent to that research. So if you were looking at films with a certain actor, you would probably want to list that actor in each film within your citation, within your works cited piece. Here, like I said earlier with the documentary, we care mostly about who directed it and who wrote the documentary. So we've got that information, followed by a comma. The next thing we see here is the date, and that is 24 July 2019, followed by a period. Now, the next bit of information, you see we've got a period there. That kind of concludes the initial part of the citation. The next thing we see here is Netflix, and this is an example of a source that has a second container. So you can think about containers like if you had a huge shelf with lots of books and maybe some other boxes and things to hold other things. So for this example, we have a film that maybe fits within this larger container of the shelf that has all of our Netflix films, if you will. So Netflix houses a bunch of movies, right? And this just happens to be one of them. So that's that secondary container. So we list that, we italicize it, we follow it with a comma. And then lastly, we have the location of that second container. And in this case, that's the URL to this specific Netflix film. The third source that you had in your activity was an email from me, and I gave you this kind of screenshot. It's a little bit fabricated for the purpose of this activity, but typically with an email you'll have this basic information, who it's sent to. In this case it was you. I sent it to your @dukes.jmu.edu email address. Who it was sent from, in this case me. A subject line, which we called MLA Olympics email. The date that it was sent, for this particular example, I chose March 23rd, 2020 at 9:05 a.m. Then you have the body of the email and my signature and information at the bottom of that. So let's take a look at how we would cite this email. Emails are pretty simple. The first thing that you have is the sender's name. Again, always doing that last name, comma, first name formatting for MLA. So in this case, Keen, Elizabeth, followed by a period. The next piece of information is the title. The title for the email is what appears in the subject line. So that is MLA Olympics email, contained in quotation marks because it's something small, followed by a period. The next piece of info here is received by, and then I have a blank, and in that blank would be your name. The email was sent to you, so it was received by your name, followed by a comma. And the last piece of info here is the date that that email was sent, 23 March 2020, followed by a period. The fourth source that you had for this activity was a specific chapter within a book. And I gave you a chapter within this book because typically you won't cite an entire book. Usually you'll find a chapter that's relevant to what you're doing. And so it's definitely more common to cite a chapter. So for this particular example, we're citing, I believe it's chapter 2. I've given you a scanned version of this book. Now, obviously this is a physical hard copy book, and because we're in this weird online kind of situation right now, we can't look at that physical hard copy book, but we are pretending that that's what we have in our possession for this source. Now, it might be a little tricky, and I chose this example on purpose, figuring out what the title is. Thinking back to what you know about document design and levels of information and hierarchy and text and font size and all of those things that we've looked at already, you can probably decipher that the title of this book is iBrain, and then there's technically a colon, and then Surviving the Technological Alteration of the Modern Mind. That's the full title. iBrain, colon, Surviving the Technological Alteration of the Modern Mind. And we see here two authors, Gary Small, MD, and Gigi Vorgan. The second inside page gives us a little better look at the title, deciphering that title and subtitle. This page shows us that the copyright was in the year 2008. And then the next page I give you is the beginning of this chapter. So we can see over here on the left, the previous page was 22. So even though it's not listed on this actual page, we can assume that that is page 23 of the book. And then I've given you all the pages. Bear with me for a second as we scroll. Until here, we finally have the last page of this chapter, which we can see here is page 46. Okay, so now let's look at what we would do for this full citation. First we have Small, Gary, MD, and Gigi Vorgan. Those are the two authors, followed by a period. Next we have the title of the specific chapter that we're looking at. And again, remember, smaller things go in quotation marks, larger things get italicized. So in this case we have quotation marks, brain gap, colon, technology dividing generations. That's the title specifically of this chapter number 2 that we're looking at. Next we have the title of the book, right? A bigger container. So again, this gets italicized. We have iBrain, Surviving the Technological Alteration of the Modern Mind. Then a comma. HarperCollins is the publisher of this book. So that comes next, followed by a comma. 2008 was the year that the book was published, again followed by a comma. And lastly, the page range for specifically this chapter. So PP period 23-46, and then a final period at the end of that citation. The fifth source you were given was actually a scholarly journal article. I've given you a little screenshot here, but let's actually look at the full text on this website. So here you can get most of the information that you need for this source. We see that Wiley Online Library is the name of this database system. We see here in this box that the journal title is the Journal of Computer Assisted Learning. The title of this specific article here is Beyond the Digital Natives Debate Toward a More Nuanced Understanding of Students' Technology Experiences. We see the authors listed here, S. Bennett and K. Matten. It was first published 26 August 2010. We've got the link to the DOI. Again, that's that permanent stable link. We've got information over here about the volume 26, issue number 5, came out in October of 2010, and the page ranges 321 to 331. All of this pertinent information to our full citation. Now this is what you will see if you click the full text option. It downloads a PDF of the full text. Everything that you need for your citation is also here. We've got the title again, the authors. We see that it starts on page 321, and then we can scroll through, we can read everything. This is the entire article. And we see here that it concludes on page 331. You can also discern from this information that it was copyrighted in 2010. We see again the Journal of Computer Assisted Learning 2010, volume 26, and the page range there. So sometimes you might have to look at the PDF itself, but you should have all of the information that you need for your full citation. So let's come over here and look at the full citation for this scholarly journal article. You'll see the authors listed here, and if you remember from the actual article that we saw, we just had the first initial of each author. So I actually had to do a little bit more digging to see the author's first names, and typically you can find that information. Articles that are published using APA format don't typically list the author's first name, so sometimes they might just have the first initial. But if that's the case, do a little more digging and you can usually find their name. So in this case, Bennett, Susan J, and Carl Matten, followed by a period. Next, we have the title of this specific article. Remember, smaller things go in quotation marks, larger things get italicized. So, title goes in quotation marks, Beyond the Digital Natives Debate, Toward a More Nuanced Understanding of the Student's Technology Experiences. And then closing period and closing quotation marks. Next, we have the Journal of Computer Assisted Learning, and again, that's a journal, it's a container, it gets italicized, followed by a comma. Next, we have the volume and the issue number, so volume 26, comma, issue number 5, comma. Next, we have the year, 2010, followed by a comma. And then the location, in this case, a page range, so PP period 321 to 331. Next, we have some more information related to the location. In this case, a DOI number. Remember that a DOI link. Again, remember DOI just means that it's a stable, permanent hyperlink to that source. So it's a DOI. And lastly, I've added the date accessed. Again, remember that is an optional element, but something that just helps you keep track of when you have last visited a source. It's especially interesting for websites because they can be changed so easily and so quickly. You could be looking at some very different information from day to day with a website, and there's really no other way to document which version of a site that you've seen other than adding that access date. The sixth source that you had for this activity was a TED Talk. So this specific one, I've given you a little screenshot here, but actually let's go to the website so we can see all the information that we need. So here's the link to the TED Talk. You see that Sherry Turkle is the presenter here from TED 2012. The title is Connected But Alone. Again, we can see February 2012 over here for the date information. And that should be all the information that we need from this one. So with that, we now see that we have the author, in this case the presenter, Turkle, Sherry, period. Next is the title of the TED Talk. Again, smaller things go in quotation marks, larger things get italicized. So Connected But Alone in quotation marks. We see that it was a TED Talk, so that comes next. Again, that's a container. Think of it as there's lots and lots of TED Talks. This is one specific one, so that gets italicized, followed by a comma. Next, we have February 2012. We don't have a specific date that this was published, but we know that it was published in February of 2012. So we have that, followed by a period. Next, we have the location, in this case, a hyperlink or a URL. So there's the URL information. And lastly, again, I've included the date access just in case this information changes at a later date. So the last source you have here is an interview, and if we were completing this activity face-to-face like we typically do in class, I would ask each of you to actually come up and approach me and interview me, but since that was not possible right now, I've just given you this basic information that's really all you need to know to formulate your citation. So we're assuming that you completed a face-to-face interview with me on March 23rd, 2020, and I answered whatever question you wanted me to answer. So for the citation there, it's really simple for interviews. We have the name of the person that you interviewed, so in this case me, Keen, Elizabeth, period, followed by personal interview, and then lastly the date that that interview took place. And again, per this example, we're assuming that it took place on the 23rd of March, 2020. So there you have it. That's all 7 sources. So now let's assume that you have all of this information typed within a Google Doc. Just a couple things to think about here. Remember that for MLA style, everything gets double spaced. So right now, this first little bit of information is double spaced, right? There's a blank line between each line and we can't actually type on it. If you need a refresher on that, that feature is right up here with line spacing. You can change it back to single and then change it just to double like that. Now, right now, my sources are here, but they're not formatted correctly. So let's look at a few things there. First of all, let's make sure our page is set up correctly. MLA calls for 1-inch margins all around, and that should be the default on whatever word processor you're using. It's the default on Google Docs here, but just in case you ever need to change that, that's how you get to the page setup. Now, the next thing I want to do here is double space my sources. So again, I'm going to go here to line spacing. I'm going to choose double. Now sometimes you might find some additional space either before or after a paragraph. And so you might want to check and see if there's the option to remove space before or remove space after the paragraph. For whatever reason, sometimes that happens. So now we've got things nice and double spaced, but now we have extra spaces that we need to take out. So right here, there's an extra space between each source right now. I'm going to hang tight for just a minute on that. The next thing I want us to look at is how to create a hanging indent. So you may know that MLA asks for the first line to be flush left with the margin and all subsequent lines of that citation to be indented 1 tab, which is 1/2 inch. So what you can do is you can put your cursor there and press the tab key on your keyboard. But look what happens. It indents the first line and nothing else. Now, some people will go here and manually force this formatting, but I highly recommend you don't do that. There's a much better way. So if we go here and we press enter and then we hit tab, that will let you do what you're trying to do. However, you have to do that every time, and if your information changes, then you can get some weird spacing issues, so don't do that. So let's go back and check out these little guys up here. You've got 2 blue things along the top ruler of the screen. We're going to take those and move them to where it says 0.50. That's 1/2 inch. That moves all of that citation over. Now we want to put our cursor on that first line and carefully grab the top rectangle. So don't get the bottom triangle, get the top rectangle. Whoop, see, I got them both. Oh, wow. There we go. The top rectangle, and then pull it over to the left margin where you have 0.00. Now you've successfully created your hanging indent. So let's go ahead and do that for all of these. We can tab over, put the cursor there, move it back. This one doesn't need it because it's only 1 line. Tab over, pull it back. Tab over, pull it back. Tab over, and pull it back. And then this last one doesn't need it again because it doesn't spill over to 2 lines. Okay, now we want to remove this unnecessary space. So we'll take that out. Now things are looking better. What's something you notice here? Any guesses? Now we need to put things in alphabetical order. So right now these sources are in no sort of order other than the order that I gave them to you for the MLA Olympics activity. So we need to do some rearranging here and put things in alphabetical order by the beginning of the citation. So this source that starts with B would go first. So I just cut and paste and move that around. So we got B. What comes next? G, which is next. So we've got the Gibbons Tess piece next. Now, the Great Hack comes next because remember, MLA does not count A, N, and the articles as part of a title. So we go to the next actual word. So the Great Hack would come after, so G-I-G-R. Then what comes next? Aha. Both of your sources from me. So now you've got two sources from the same author. What happens? You go to the next thing in the citation. So here M comes before P, so we have it in the correct order. Now, when you have multiple sources with the same author, you put 5 hyphens for any of those sources after the first one, and that tells the reader that everything relates back to that same person. So we've got the 5 hyphens there. Then we've got our Gary Small, and then finally the Sherry Turkle. And just like that, we have a properly formatted works cited page. Now, there's one last thing I want to caution you about, and that is copying and pasting information. Sometimes I might write to you in your feedback, copy and paste fail, and that means a couple things. If we've got this information here from, let's say we copied and pasted from something like EasyBib, there's one surefire way to show that you have used some sort of citation generator and copied and pasted information, and that is usually in the quotation marks. If you look here, they just don't look quite right. And that's because they're not the right font. They usually, when you copy and paste, are in a sans serif font. And they have to be changed to match the body font, which is Times New Roman, which is serif. So that's one easy way. Sometimes information that's supposed to be italicized doesn't convert properly when you copy and paste, so you might lose some of that formatting as well. Also beware if you're copying and pasting, say, a quote from a PDF, you might get a lot of weird spaces kind of interjected between words. And again, that's because a PDF isn't really like an editable Word file. It's not an editable document. So sometimes if it has, say, justified spacing, and you copy and paste that, it just gets converted into your Google Doc or your Word document as additional spaces. So I know it's convenient to copy and paste, but sometimes it's worth just the couple more seconds that it takes to actually type out that information. Now, the last thing that we need to look at talking about MLA and getting you in a really good position to move forward is how to format your parenthetical in-text citations. So part 2 of the MLA Olympics activity asks you to properly format an in-text citation with 3 different quotes. So I have those on the screen here in front of me. And we'll just start with this first one. So we see here that this quote came from iBrain Chapter 2, page 25. So let's scroll up, and this is our iBrain citation. So what information do we need? We need the author's last name and the page number. So in this case, Small and Vorgan are the authors. So we'll go here, we'll remove the period. And below this says that this quote came from page 25, so then 25, a closing parenthesis, and a period. Now that one is correct. Next, we've got a quote from the Breeze article. So let's go up and find the Breeze article. That is this Gibbons Tess piece. So for this one, there's no page number because it's accessed online. So all we need is Gibbons. So here we will have a parenthesis, Gibbons, a closing parenthesis, and a final punctuation. And last but not least, we've got a quote from the Scholarly Journal article. We'll scroll up and find it. That is this one. So we've got Bennett and Matten. So we remove the period. Bennett and Matten, and this is from page 325, closing parenthesis and a period. That will properly punctuate that source. So very easy to do. A couple things to keep in mind. You typically, if it's a period ending the sentence, you don't put that until after the citation. If it's something like a question mark or an exclamation mark, it can stay put and then still follow the in-text citation with a period. Now, a couple things that aren't in this exercise that I want to talk about briefly. And that is an example where you might have a source with multiple authors. Remember, MLA says anything more than three or more authors, you use the phrase et al, et space al period. So if this source had 3 or more authors, let's say Bennett is the first one, then it would look like this, et al. Very similar, just slightly different. The other thing that you might encounter is something called a quote within a quote, or an indirect source. So basically, you're reading and you find a quote that you really like and you want to use in your own research, but it's someone else's quote within the source where you found it. The first thing you should try to do is locate that original source. Look at the references in the source where you found it and see if you can find that original source, navigate to that original source, and document that original source. It takes a little bit more time, but it's what you need to do for quality research. If that's impossible, then you would use quoted in. So here's an example of an in-text citation that is an indirect source. So a quote within a quote, if you will. Let's read what's on the page here. So in this example, the quote that's listed here was found in this Wiseman text on page 259. But Wiseman is not the actual author of these words. This is how we know that this is an indirect quote. We use QTD period in, and then you list the source, the author's last name and page number where you found that quote. Let's say this quote was in something else, but we found it in Bennett and Matten, quoted in. All right, folks, there you have it. We've looked at the 7 different sources that you had from the MLA Olympics activity. I've walked you through all the different steps for locating the information that you need for the full citations and talking about those different citations themselves. Hopefully this helps you have a little bit better understanding for how MLA formatting works so that when you go to apply it into your own research and your own work for this project, it'll be much easier. I think it's really important to have an understanding of how the citation system works instead of just relying on some sort of citation generator to get it right. So hopefully now you kind of have an understanding of the order of those pieces of information, the different punctuations, the different ways that you put things in quotation marks and different information that gets italicized and all of that so that you're feeling really good and confident with your understanding and application of MLA style. I wish you all a really good, productive week ahead, and I'll see you next week for another one of these little mini lessons. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time, guys.